Thank you very much. We're going to be starting our last colloquium session of the afternoon, although that is not the end of the colloquium in two senses. One is our celebration of Shabbat and of our movement continues this evening with a special Havdalah event. Not only do we mark the end of Shabbat, but we mark an important transition in the lives of 5 of the students of our institute. 4 of them are graduating as madrichim or madrichot, as Wegweisers, as leaders in our movement, and one of them will be receiving a master's degree in recognition of his culmination of study on the way to becoming a humanistic rabbi. And so I invite all of you to come back for that. We will also be celebrating the conferral of a special award from the Society for Humanistic Judaism in recognition of lifetime achievement. And I'll also be speaking briefly about Sherwin Wine's new book that just came out. Someone said, "How did he make a new book?"
We didn't believe that.
And I'll tell you the story if you come back tonight for the Havdalah celebration. It begins at 8 o'clock this evening. I invite you to enjoy each other's company for dinner. There are, again, many options available in the program book. And in Evanston itself, there are lots and lots of choices, most of them good. And I won't tell you which ones aren't because I don't know. But most importantly, the colloquium sessions resume tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock. Rabbi Sivan Mas from Tumorah IISHJ in Israel will come back to this stage and offer her perspective on Israel, quote, half Jewish, and the Jewish world as a whole. And then I finally get to try and wrap it up and remind you of what we learned and look forward to the implications, even if I'm afraid, tomorrow at 11 o'clock. And so without any further ado, I'll turn it over to Rabbi Miriam Jerez to lead our panel discussion, One, Both, or Neither, Half Jewish Experiences. Thank you.
I see awake people. That's very good. I found the framing of one, both, or neither an interesting frame, and I had just a couple of thoughts about those concepts. So what the Jewish community has been telling a lot of us for a while is that if you're going to have an intermarriage, you have to choose one, or else you're going to confuse the children. Well, along came Jim Renson and Judith Pensock and the Intermarriage Handbook, and they told us that our children are only as confused as their parents are. Both. Both is a little bit like spiritual. You really don't know what it means. I had an experience where a couple came to see me before they were engaged. He was Chaldean Catholic. She was conservative Jewish. And they said, well, we think we've got it figured out. We're going to raise them both. Well, I either gave them the greatest gift of their life or they're, hating me forever because I said, well, tell me about that. What does that look like to you? And he said, well, Judaism is a religion of the home. So we're going to raise the children in Catholic school and catechism and, go through the whole Catholic system. And we're going to do all the Jewish holidays with your family, with her family. And she said, what? I thought it meant neither. We'll raise them nothing? I don't understand how anything can be nothing, as if you can somehow have a nothing identity. Or if you can decide on anything with any kinds of intelligence when you haven't been exposed to anything. I found this book, Half-Life, very illuminating, and I just have 3 short excerpts that I want to read to you that address this whole question of half. Half. I never really considered what it meant to be half, although now that I am considering it, I'm all halves. I'm half Jewish, half Catholic, half American, half French. I'm often half asleep. I'm half computer geek, half artist. I tend to do a half-assed job at both. Half the time, I have half a mind to be doing something else. Is it possible that my halfness comes from being born all halves? Did growing up half Jewish in a halfway real city with half Jewish and half Gentile friends set me up for a lifetime of halves? Half Jewish. Like anyone of mixed heritage, I envied other children the ease with which they said, I'm Catholic, my family is Chinese, etc. Not that I wanted particularly to be Catholic or Chinese, or that I thought much about what it meant to be, but I wanted to say that I was something specific, as easy as saying I'm 8, I'm a girl. As it turns out, one is not 8 for very long, and the same goes for girlhood, and even those seemingly more permanent aspects of selfhood. Those of us from mixed backgrounds may not be sure of our proportions, but in that regard, we're no different from any other human subject. So why does it bother me? This question, am I or am I not a real Jew? It bothers me. For many years, I called myself half Jewish on my mother's side. This piece of diction simplified fraction cordoned off an area of self. It led Jewish friends to assume that I knew the customs of Shabbat, and non-Jewish friends to regard me as somewhat more exotic. Likely it led a few people to think poorly of me, to think, so that explains it. But I've never felt myself the target of anti-Semitic sentiment. Perhaps this alone confirms how little experience I have as a Jew. So I find this term half-Jewish has misled us all in its suggestion that I know my own proportions. If half of me is Jewish and half of me is not, we come to the first sticking point. Which half? Or more specifically, which parts belong to the Jewish half? Not my features, which mimic my father's. My mother has the hook nose, the deep olive skin that resists wrinkles, and the thick black hair I always read as Jewish. Not my academic bent. Mine is not the intellectual Jewish family swapping arguments over the New York Times, evaluating films and art exhibits. Not my name, though named in my mother's tradition after the most recently deceased member of the family, the name itself had belonged to my Catholic uncle, Daniel. Not my voice. When my father detected a rough trace of Brooklyn Yiddish in my 18-month-old baby talk, he cautioned my mother to watch her pronunciation and mine. The often quoted quip in New York City that everyone is Jewish, perhaps I am Jewish to the same degree as a lifelong New Yorker. I love a good bagel, I'm a ferocious bargain hunter, and a refined neurotic. My hypochondria is matched only by a few highly skilled old wives, as are my theories on what cures a cold. I make a mean rugelach, I never predict, rarely even dare to imagine a positive outcome, because as any fool knows, that is the best way to ensure ruin. But really, this is a problem of essentialism. Do all Jews have certain traits in common? Do half Jews have half of these traits in common? And then, what is to worry without nagging, to defend without the persecution, to pray without the Torah? And while I can examine the Jewish stereotypes, can examine the home places and families of my Jewish friends, I can never isolate the gesture that certifies my Jewishness. To understand this qualifier half, I must consider terms such as octoroon, half-breed, mulatto, multiracial, and race itself. How many drops of Jewish blood make a Jew? Biologists would agree that there is no real basis for the division of races as we know them, and while those same biologists would likely cringe at my less than thorough explanation, it is no less accurate. Humans are, in fact, and categorically one race. The genetic structures of a black man and a white woman may be more similar than those of two white women. End of narrative. Yet race remains salient, and this is a society obsessed with quantifiable difference. Perhaps that's why I still struggle to isolate something about myself that is unarguably Jewish. Some birthmark that proves some portion of me is part of a people. Beginning of narrative. And what of the half that isn't Jewish? I'm as hard-pressed to construct the subject not Jewish self as I am to construct the half-Jewish self. The other suggestion inherent in the term half, the one from which I recoil most fiercely, is that I am, anyone is, merely half mother and half father. Now I say my mother's family is Jewish, and even this is reductive. Even this feels a bit of charade. What I certainly have learned in my life and in my work is that the experience of anyone cannot be reduced to clear and concise categories. It can, however, be described. And we are very fortunate this afternoon to have four very interesting young people to describe their experience. And I am going to leave it to them to start us off by introducing themselves and telling us a little bit about themselves.
Hello. Hi, everybody. Shabbat Shalom. My name is Jared Jackson. I was born in Philadelphia in the early part of the 80s, and I was born into a section that was pretty integrated. But then my family moved to New Jersey. Please, no sob stories, right? So I found myself having a pretty agnostic African-American father and a Jewish mother in a town that was primarily African-American and Baptist. There were 3 synagogues in the town, but they all moved to a little not-so-well-known town called Cherry Hill. Oh, you've heard of it? I grew up going to Quaker school and going to public school, and having a lot of experiences both in the Jewish community and in the African American community, which were equally negative. Just one thing, I tried to go to Hebrew school. My family, my father died when I was just about 3, so my mom had to struggle on her own to get us any type of Jewish education. We entered into Hebrew school, and my mom's scraping together what little money that she could. And found out almost at the end of the year of my Hebrew school experience that the rabbi's son came over to my sister and said, "Oh, well, my dad doesn't want you here." If anyone doesn't know what this means, it's a word that starts with an N. And so we found out that he wasn't the only one who had that sentiment in the congregation. And instead of my mom forcing us into a situation where we would be completely scrutinized over a period of time, we left and didn't really feel safe in Jewish community. And that happened, like, I think I was around 7 or 8. I didn't step foot into a synagogue or a Jewish space until I was 21. And my story is, yes, it's unique, it's my story, but there are a lot of people who share the same story. And on the other side of things, living in the town that I lived in, there were a lot of people who would try to evangelize and convert my mom in the supermarket or at her office in a public school, which is always nice, right? The whole separation of church and state. And so there was a feeling of being unsafe as a Jew in the town that I lived, but unsafe as an African American in the Jewish community that was near. So basically, we did rituals. We did Yom Kippur and Rosh Hashanah and Passover Seder at home. Some people ask me, like, well, you were in a part of a synagogue, so you had nothing. That's not true. I had my sisters, I had my mom, I even had a bubby. And for those of you who don't know what that means, it's Yiddish for grandmother. Throughout my life, I've really connected with other people who shared what I call, or my organization, Jews and All Accused, calls dual heritage. Somebody who has non-Jewish heritage and Jewish heritage, whatever the mixes may be on either end. And this has continued throughout my life. I'm actually not, I didn't go to school for Jewish studies. I have a degree in jazz performance. I'm a saxophone player. So I'm kind of off the beaten path, which is the way I like it. And I got involved in just doing Jewish things when I turned 21, and it kept on building up and building up. I've been to Israel about 10 times. Thank you, Birthright. I received an award, actually, that was specifically for Birthright alumni who came back and made a significant impact in their Jewish community. It was called the Charlie Award. It was named after Charles Schusterman of the Charles and Lynn Schusterman Foundation. And now that's part of what's known as the ROI community. And I started, shortly after that, I actually started working for Birthright Israel Next. And even though I really thank Birthright Israel Next and Birthright Israel for the time that I spent with those two organizations, but I really found that for me, there was still something lacking. You know, I was connecting with other dual heritage Jews, but I wasn't connecting with them in a way that was really on the deeper level, other than, oh, you have one non-Jewish parent. Me too. Great. Let's do Kiddush. You know, there wasn't a space to talk about the deeper issues, the deeper celebration of dual heritage. So in 2009, I started this organization, Jews and All Accused, and we do programming for people who have one non-Jewish parent, or they're an adoptee, or they're a Jew by choice, or in some cases, they're the child of. Adult children is kind of I don't know, it seems like an oxymoron, but I guess with me and the rest of the millennials, maybe that's a fitting term. But I created this in order to celebrate dual heritage, in order to bring about change in the world, because there are gateways, there are people who are self-proclaimed gatekeepers We've been talking a lot about the statistics and what happens like when you're sitting in an office and like crunching numbers and all, and not really what's happening on the ground. My work is about what's happening on the ground. What people are experiencing, the negative things and the positive things that they're experiencing in Jewish community. Whether that's being asked, oh, so are you really Jewish? You don't look Jewish. Which you may laugh at that, but to somebody, even though you may think it's something slight, something that you say every day, oh, this person doesn't look Jewish. Oh, they'll probably find a husband or a wife sooner than somebody who, quote unquote, looks Jewish, or other comments like that. But to somebody who has dual heritage, it might be a wall that gets put up where they don't feel safe in that environment. Where if you go to a synagogue and you walk in, you have the person at the door that greets you. And if they ask you, so why are you here? And it's the tone of the voice and also their body language and all. Like if somebody asks you, why are you here before you're actually there, it causes a problem, you know? And there are tons of issues, there are tons of things. I'll probably wait till the questioning to answer your questions, but I just wanted to let you know a little bit about my life and my organization, and I'll pass it along to Erica.
Hi. My name is Erica Sosa. I'm also a child of intermarriage. I'll tell you a little bit about my family and my experience. So my mother is Jewish, and my father is not Jewish. My father is from Puerto Rico. His family is Catholic. He's not particularly interested in religion, and he never really liked Catholicism very much, and he had no interest in raising us Catholic whatsoever. And I would say our family was very secular until we were about, until I was about 8 or 9, something like that. And my parents gave us the choice of what religion we wanted to be, which is, I don't know, progressive or new agey or, kind of funny to some people. But it worked for us somehow. And we grew up in a very Jewish community, and all of our friends were Jewish. So when they asked us what religion we wanted to be, we said Jewish. And that was sort of the start of us feeling kind of part of this community, because it was really a community that influenced that decision rather than a belief system for us. So my family, sort of beyond just my parents, is incredibly multicultural. Sort of a kind of classic American tale. Lots of immigration in our family. On my dad's side, on the Puerto Rican side, his brother married a white Catholic woman. His sister married an African American man. On my mom's side, her sister married an Indian Hindu man. He has 18 brothers and sisters. So our family grew up with lots of Indian celebrations. My cousins are half Indian. And then they both married interculturally as well. One of my cousins married a Muslim from Pakistan, and the other one married a Japanese American. So we have lots and lots and lots of traditions in our family. And they're all very valued and respected. So the idea that, we were half Jewish was really not a big deal at all. As for my experience in the community, I grew up in Buffalo Grove. Some of you may know it. It's a very Jewish community. I went to Stevenson High School. There's a lot of Jews there. And so most of my friends were Jewish growing up. I feel like my experience is very, very different from Jared's in that I felt, incredibly part of this community. I never questioned my Jewish identity. Probably until much later, but growing up, it was sort of taken for granted that, I'm not a half Jew, I'm a Jew, and like a lot of my friends have a parent who's not Jewish, and so what? And we never talked about whether that was it was their mom who was Jewish or their dad who was Jewish, and it just wasn't really an issue. We were all just kind of kids growing up in this environment. I went to a Reform synagogue, which I believe no longer exists, but I had a bat mitzvah. I grew up going to Hebrew school. So I would say that I did feel very integrated in this community. Probably something that I felt less a part of the community was my religious beliefs. I didn't really identify religiously, yet I still felt very Jewish. So after my bat mitzvah, I kind of dropped off the face of the Jewish earth for a long time because I wasn't quite sure how to connect if it wasn't in a religious way. And then I went on Birthright. So kind of a classic story. I went on Birthright when I was 25, and it was sort of this first time where I felt like I connected again to my Jewish heritage, and it was a very meaningful experience for me because I felt, being in Israel, that I could connect on a very different level to my Judaism than I could connect here in the U.S. because I saw that there was this sort of secular Judaism that I was so fascinated by. It was so interesting, like, oh, I don't have to, go to synagogue every Friday and I can still be Jewish. And I was really excited about that, so I got really interested in the idea of Jewish peoplehood and came back and started to get a little bit more interested in the Jewish community. So I became a Birthright Israel Next Fellow. There's a lot of talk about Birthright here this weekend. So I became a Birthright Israel Next Fellow, and then I started working full-time for Birthright Israel Next for the next year and a half after that. So I worked professionally in the Jewish community for about 2.5 years. And so that brought up, all sorts of different questions about my Jewish identity that I never really thought about. And actually being here today brought up all sorts of other questions that I didn't think about either. And I hadn't even thought about the idea of, being half Jewish in a really long time, which is also sort of a testament to the fact that I didn't have to think about it, that it wasn't really so much of an issue for me. And I attribute that to a lot of things, probably because my mother is Jewish, and so halakhically I am Jewish, and people don't question that. Another thing is, I'm white, so that's not really an issue. And I think that if there were these other situations going on, if my father was Jewish, if I was a darker skinned person, I think that I would encounter probably a lot more difficulty in this way, but I haven't encountered that. So anyway, I can talk more about my experience professionally in the Jewish community later, so I'll pass it on for now. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Nika Jacobson, and I identify myself as Jewish and Catholic. My mom is Catholic and my dad is Jewish, so I guess you could say I'm a cashew. I'm a senior at Whitney Young High School, which is a public school in the city of Chicago. For grammar school, I went to a Catholic school called Francis Xavier Ward, and it's in the city, and you might think, oh, she went to a Catholic school. That's kind of weird. But they had 2 different tracks of religious education, and one was for kids who were Catholic and their parents wanted them to go through the Catholic track. But I went through the other track, and it included kids of other Christian denominations and other religions, and I was the other religion person, which was Jewish. I went to family school from kindergarten to 8th grade, and I graduated from there in 2008. If you're not familiar, the family school is a interfaith Sunday school for Catholic and Jewish children who their parents want to raise them as both. And so every Sunday we would learn from both faiths and both traditions and cultures, and we would learn about holidays, and we'd study the Torah and the Bible. We'd learn both the morals and values of each faith, and we had the best of both worlds. I belong to Old St. Patrick's Church, which is also in the city, and Makom Shalom, which is a Reformed Jewish synagogue in the city. I've been baptized, I've had a baby naming, I have had a communion, and I have had a bat mitzvah. Yes. And next year I'm studying at the University of Colorado Boulder, and I'm going into integrative physiology and dance. So I guess you could say I don't know. For me, it's just, I identify myself as Jewish and Catholic, not half Jewish and half Catholic, because for me, it's both. And I found a really great way to integrate my faith together to create my own faith. And so that's my story.
I'm a bit older than the rest of the people here, so I'm going to go back further and start with how my parents met. Well, this courtship had gotten off because my father's brother was studying at Madison briefly, and he somehow knew my mother, and so my father and my mother were introduced, and so things got going pretty strong there, and my father's mother heard about this, and she was in Philadelphia, so she got on a train, and she came down to Madison, and kind of unannounced, and she called, and my mother's parents went to meet her at the train station, and my mother's mother had to make a chicken dinner really fast, but they had a meal together, and everybody sat at the table. My father's mother and my mother's parents, and my mother was there. And so the older generation sat around and they discussed this issue, and they agreed that this was not going to go any further. And my mother was like, "I'm right here," So that was settled, obviously. So, but my mother's parents went out of town at one point, and at the same time, my father got pretty drunk, and he called my mother up, and he said, "Can I come over?" And so things got going again. They were engaged. During that time, my mother had read the Exodus, and she's very interested in Jews, and she was working for a rabbi, and he agreed to marry them, even though she had not converted. And at this time, this did not happen, right? But he knew my mother's father, and as he felt like he didn't want to offend his friend. So out of deference to my grandfather, he married them. So it was an intermarriage. So my mother converted later, actually, I think after I was born. And I was raised in Bethor, literally in Bethor, because she was working there, and eventually became the Sunday school principal. So I was there more than once a week. And I started being there really before I was in kindergarten. And so I was really part of the Society of Humanistic Judaism in Bethor. And let's see, so we moved to Cleveland when I was 14 years old. And I studied at a distance in order to be confirmed at Bethor. So it sounds like, I was really well integrated and everything was groovy, but, also as a child, I was very aware that I wasn't accepted under the law of return. And I was really aware when that changed. And also, I don't know, probably many of you know Cher's song, Half Breed. That really resonated with me. So then when I was in Cleveland, the people that I really connected with were either children of intermarriage or atheists, and were rejecting what they were learning in Sunday school at some level. But I was the only one I knew who really loved going to Sunday school. And it wasn't really until I was in college that I had the experience of secular Jews and other Jews regularly questioning my identity as a Jew. So what Maya was talking about the other day about, people imposing other identities on you, that's when I really started having that experience. And it was like they were really looking for some confirmation that I really wasn't a Jew. Like, they'd open up my refrigerator and you're not using the right kind of mayonnaise. And it wasn't even me that bought it. It was my Borneo boyfriend. So, and I think this is a really common experience for many people, especially Reform Jews, who are patrilineal. Over time I've lived all over the country and even in Canada, and I've experienced many different kinds of congregations, Reform, Reconstructionist, many different kinds of Haverot in D.C., Cleveland, and Pittsburgh. Never found a good fit in Montreal. I had that same experience, like, what are you doing here? So I've had various levels of welcome in various places, and of course the most welcoming one was the Haverah that I co-led with Robin Margolis in D.C. It was a Jewish feminist spirituality and study group, which needed a shorter name, we decided, so we called it Besh Shekinah. And I really recommend this as a good solution to fellow half-Jews if they have the time and the inclination. It was really the best time I've ever had in Judaism. And there is a student group in Minnesota that's just now forming, and it's using resources from the Half-Jewish Network, which I'm on the board of, to build up. I'll stop there.
If people are thinking about questions, we really wanted to make this program very interactive. So hold your cards up and somebody will pick them up and bring them up. I'd like you, if you can, talk a little bit more about times that you felt incredibly included. And Jared, you did a really good job of talking about when you did feel excluded, but if there are times when you also felt incredibly excluded in community, and how that affected your identity and feelings about the groups. Any one of you?
For anyone of you who didn't hear, Miriam wanted us to talk about basically the opposite of what we talked about, either being welcomed or being unwelcome. So I will talk about being welcome. So I, when I was running programming at a university that I went to, like at the time the group was known as the Hillel Group on campus, and then it became the Jewish Student Union because somebody forgot to fill out the proper paperwork. Anyway, so there was a small congregation that was actually labeled unaffiliated, uncategorized by the Jewish Federation because it had so many people from different streams. And it was the only synagogue within, a mile radius of the university, and beyond that, the next one was like 10 miles down the road. So I went there for high holiday services, not knowing anyone, But speaking to the rabbi beforehand, saying, hey, I'm bringing a bunch of students, obviously they're like, oh, students, yeah, come on in. But I went in there, and the first question somebody asked me was, hey, would you like an aliyah? I mean, like, we're just, giving them out today. You look like you're cool. And then I walked in, and as I walked in, I was like, looking over my shoulder, like, isn't somebody gonna ask me any questions or something? Like, not anything like completely stupid, like pull down your pants and show me you're Jewish. But like just like the regular questions that I was used to hearing, like, so is your mother Jewish? Or, kind of talking in that soft NPR voice. And I'm sorry. Okay, sorry. With NPR, they talk really softly and like ask you all these deep questions. But I found myself like feeling a little bit awkward because I wasn't feeling awkward. And somebody let me sit down, grab a siddur, and like just go along with everybody else and be part of the community. And then people would just ask me, hey, you're hungry, you want to come back to my place? It was just very inviting, welcoming, letting me be who I am in the space like that I'm trying to be in. And that was like that's still one of my favorite welcoming experiences.
Okay, I'll go next. So I guess I talked a lot about inclusion. I don't really want to talk that much about ways that I've felt excluded from the Jewish community because I feel like I would just kind of be searching for something just to say it, and I don't feel excluded from the Jewish community. There are times when I felt like a little bit of an outsider, but I don't necessarily think it was coming from a place of ill will on the part of the people I was talking to. I think sometimes people say some things to me that I suppose could be considered a bit ignorant, but I don't think it's out of malice. I think that people are just genuinely curious about my background. There are times, I'll talk a little bit about times where I've felt maybe an outsider. I can think of one thing anecdotally. So when I was working for Birthright Israel Next, I was doing a lot of programming for young Jewish adults who were exploring identity. And one thing I did was run a reading group that lasted for about 2 years. And every month we would just read different articles and talk about our Jewish identities. And I started this group, I felt very much a part of this group. And one month we were talking about Hanukkah. And also, by the way, different people chose the topics they wanted to talk about, so it wasn't all just, me deciding on these topics. So somebody picked Hanukkah, and this was a guy who had married a non-Jew, and they were, they were the only married couple, and definitely the only intermarried couple who came to our reading group. And so the conversation on Hanukkah sort of ended up being a conversation on Christmas, and Hanukkah as a reaction to Christmas, and kind of how we felt about that as Jewish people. And I felt just fine about Christmas. I didn't feel like Christmas was a threat to me. I didn't feel like it sort of infringed on my Jewish identity. Like I felt very comfortable with it. I went to Christmas celebrations at my uncle's house. We had a Christmas tree, which, these people were just like, they couldn't believe it that we had a Christmas tree, and I still felt Jewish, So it was interesting to me to hear the reactions from all these people who I considered my peers in my reading group, and they just couldn't understand how you can celebrate Christmas and still feel Jewish. And so I just asked them, there were probably about 10 or 12 people there, and I said, how many of you guys have a parent who's not Jewish? And none of them did. And I think that's why they couldn't understand. For me, it was very easy to understand. For them, it was very difficult. It was a challenge. So that was maybe one time when I sort of felt outside of the conversation, and I realized not that I'm excluded, but that I just have a very different experience and a very different upbringing that is much more multicultural in a lot of ways.
I think I've been very blessed to have a lot of inclusive experiences. At my bat mitzvah and my communion and my baptism and my baby naming, I had a rabbi and a priest present at all of them, and so it's been a very inclusive experience within the Jewish community and the Catholic community. I guess I have yet to experience exclusive ones when I go off to college and in the future. But I know who I am, and I think that'll keep me strong and with my Jewish faith as well. And I think what I've experienced with other children or kids is that they'll say so what religion are you, or what type of heritage do you have? And I say, oh, well, I'm Catholic and Jewish. And then they're like, oh, you can't be both. That's not possible. So it's been more of kids not really understanding that there's other ways of doing things. And for me, it's been I was raised this way, so I didn't know any differently. And this is how it was. And it was perfectly fine. And now that I'm older, I've chosen to keep both of my faiths. So it's a decision I've made for myself. But I think I can also bring to the table for a lot of other people that kind of a diversity that maybe they've never heard of before. So I hope to be included in the future, but I know that I might face some aversion.
Yeah, I don't think I would use the word excluded for my experiences. Certainly was in a warm, loving place here in Deerfield, and there was no problem at that time. For later, I mean, there were a series of, I guess I would call them slights, maybe, and sometimes they were, often they were from friends and, people who were just sort of trying to play with me, but it was just a sore topic for me. So those things kind of add up. And the other side of it, I'd say, is that a lot of us stifle expression about the other side of our family when, we might be describing our families to other people. It would be naturally talking about your whole family. Well, oftentimes if we're in, in one setting, especially if we identify as Jewish, we may not talk so much about the other side of the family, or may not even know that much about the other side of the family. And certainly as I've gotten older, I've met more of my relatives on the non-Jewish side, and so I have some wild stories from that side. It would be fun to share them, but I never know, should I share this story? I mean, my grandfather, at one point he was his father set him up with Al Capone's hitman. I mean, that's a great story to tell in Chicago, right? So, got him here safely so that no pirates on the highway would do anything terrible to him, and they did need the gun, so to do that. So, yeah. So there's, I mean, you kind of lose some of the color of your life that you could share with other people when you do stifle yourself, and but if you don't do it, then you may be outing people in your family, or there may be repercussions. So I was nervous coming here. I mean, my mom wasn't so happy that I might be representing myself as in a way that's not Jewish, because she worked so hard for me to have this solid Jewish identity, and she wanted it to be seamless, she said, and so kind of broke her heart, but she came around, and likewise I have a daughter, and I did a lot so that she would be Jewish, and so I hope this doesn't affect her. So yeah.
You talked about slights, and I think if you feel safe enough here to give us an example, it would be very helpful, because I think a lot of times people don't really even understand that what they're saying causes those hurt feelings. So if you can think of an example that you feel comfortable sharing, I think it would be helpful for people here.
Oh, I don't think most people here would do this, but I mean, you know, like I have friends who grew up conservative, or like the Canadian version of that, and you know, they say, well, you're not really Jewish, you know, you know, and haha, and you know, not so haha for me. So, yeah, and the business. Actually, I got more of it in college from the secular Jews, and then other times there would be people who just assumed that I'm not Jewish, and I could never get into that group. You know, they were like only the Jews here, and those sort of things. Some other idea, but I forgot what it was.
Okay. So I have a question from the audience for Nika. Have you selected things that you find in common with Judaism and Christianity? And if yes, what are they?
I definitely find a lot of similarities between the two, especially in my morals and values. When I was training for my bat mitzvah, I was under the direction of Mr. Eli Berkman, and he's absolutely wonderful, and he took me in. And I definitely learned a lot about Judaism then in the 2 years I was working. And I kind of came up with, for the idea for Judaism that I ended up accepting was that justice is really what melts the butter for Jews. Like that's what drives them. And for Christians, love is more of what they follow. And I think it's more because they follow the teachings of Jesus. And both are great values and like morals that everyone follows. I mean, we want love in our life and we want justice. And so I've kind of integrated both of them into my life so that justice is like a core value for me, but that Catholicism, and that love in Catholicism is also a core value. So although they have like different priorities, in the end, Jews also want love, and Catholic or Christians also want justice. And so there's similarities in that. And some of the traditions sometimes overlap a bit, not like the Passover tradition, but I mean, Holy Thursday, Passover, that was Passover. And so at Old St. Patrick's Church, they actually have a Holy Thursday celebration where there's Mass, but they also have like a Seder. And so it's these great combinations where I can see the history of both and like relate them now to my life and how it relates to the modern day world.
So this person says there's always talk of confusion when being confronted with defining oneself. And we heard a little bit about that, but really not a lot. So if you think you didn't feel that confusion, why don't you feel confused? Because I am very confused all the time.
I'm usually confused, but not necessarily, and I'm always questioning my my Jewish faith and my faith in people, especially questionable people. But as far as growing up, and like my family did have a Christmas tree as well. It was more so to honor our Father, who art in heaven. Anyway, then you know, believing one or the other, or being confused. We did go to Easter celebrations. We, you know, with our Catholic and Christian friends, and we did things at home. But there was still no confusion as to whether or not we're Jewish. That was like a cornerstone of me and my sisters 3 out of the 4 because I have one half sister who's Christian. That was just a cornerstone of our identity, and that's how we lived our lives, and there was really no confusion religiously.
I think that for me, I don't call myself confused, I call myself questioning. And it's a different way of looking at it because now instead of like, well, I don't know what the answer is, it's just, I'll never know what the answer is. People always ask me like, well, do you believe that Jesus is the Messiah if you're Catholic? And even though, but in Judaism, like, you don't, like, that's not who the Messiah is. And for me, I don't really plan on answering that question. I just kind of like look for things in everyday life to kind of, like bring about hope in my life. And if that's the Jewish way or the Catholic way, it's what it is. I'll always be questioning like, well, should I go to Mass Sunday? Should I, like, what part of my, like, my Jewish life do I want to bring and continue to practice? But I know that the best way to figure that out is just by doing it. And hopefully I'll get more of my questions answered. But right now I'm pretty content with my core values because I know that's going to keep me going. And I really hope to explore more of both my faiths.
I'm sort of still trying to figure out what you mean by confusion. But I mean, when I was young, we would go to my mother's house and our parents' house, and they would have a Christmas tree, and we'd celebrate Christmas with them, and that was because they were Christian, and we shared presents there, and that was really clear that that's what we were doing, and it didn't feel confusing to me. It was because that was their holiday, and it didn't feel like it was ours. We didn't celebrate Christmas at home. We didn't have a tree. My cousins are Jewish. They have a tree. Everybody, 2 Jewish parents. They've always had a tree. My grandmother had a tree for the children so they shouldn't feel left out, and they continued that tradition. But my mother converted to Judaism. She's like, we're not having a tree. So we never had a tree. My grandmother died when I was 8, and then we continued that tradition, I think, a couple of years at my aunt's house, and then that kind of fell apart. So, but I never felt like, oh, we're both or anything like that. I always identified as Jewish, and it was never a discussion in our family that, like we were trying to combine 2 in some way. It was. Yeah.
I have to tell you something personal because you know that I knew your parents from way back. And I always knew that somebody wasn't Jewish originally, but I always thought it was your mother that was the Jewish one.
Everybody thinks so. I went on a trip once with a friend who's very Jewish, and she met my parents in Florida, and we stayed over there, and so she spent a day with them, and we left, and she's like, oh, so your dad converted, and I was like, no, actually, it was my mother, and she's like, no, you're wrong. She just was right. That's when she thought I was confused.
Wait.
Oh, she spent quite a while trying to convince me.
That's great.
She's like, no, you're. So she picked up. My father got more. His parents were Russian Jewish and German Jewish, and he picked up more of the effect of his father, who was German Jewish. So to her, she is very Eastern. And so she was like, well, he's so cold, it's like, which I don't see him that way, but so, yeah, so she was like, your mother, she's so huggy and she's warm.
This is when stereotypes really don't work. So we've talked a little bit about it, but I'd like to explore it further about the trend and tendency to combine holidays, you know, the Christmas and Hanukkah bush and, you know, things like that. I just would like to know how you've experienced that in your lives or what you think about combining holidays or keeping them separate.
I guess I'll start. So I wanted to talk about this tree stuff a little bit because everyone seems really obsessed with the tree. Um, so yeah, like in my family, having a tree was like everybody had one, and as multicultural as my family is, like, you know, my cousins who were half Indian and half Jewish, and nobody was Christian, and they had a tree. And we'd go over to my Jewish grandfather's house for Christmas, and he had a tree, and we'd open presents on Christmas, and like, you know, and it just didn't even occur to us that this like wasn't really like, or that this might have been in conflict with our Judaism, because it just wasn't, and we saw it sort of as this American thing to do, more than, you know, a Christian thing to do. We didn't see it that way at all. In terms of sort of combining holidays, I actually don't feel like we really did that. We didn't do like Christmaka or call it a Hanukkah bush or anything like that. We did have, this is kind of funny, it was on our door of the house. It was like a picture that I drew. I wish I had a picture of it, because it was like this symbol that was like above the door for forever. And it was this little drawing, and there was like a big Christmas tree in the middle, and at the top ornament was a Star of David, and it said, you know, Happy Hanukkah, Merry Christmas, and it was just always like on our front door. And I don't know, that's the way it was. But we didn't quite combine holidays, but we definitely acknowledged that they were a part of our life, and that was fine.
Yeah, that goes the same for my family, that we practice all the holidays, but we don't combine them. Like for Christmas, we have our Christmas tree, but that's because my Slovenian Catholic side of the family practices Christmas, and they come over and we celebrate Christmas together. And then when Hanukkah starts, we light the candles and we say the prayers for Hanukkah. So we combine it. We don't really combine it. It's very different traditions, but they just happen around the same time. And the same thing is with Passover. When Passover starts, it's just a Jewish Seder, and we do all the prayers, and you tell the story, and you have to go find the Afikomen, and that stays the same. But they all kind of coincide at the same time.
Has anyone asked the question, why is there a tree? Like even in sorry. Right. 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 Yeah. It was something that was co-opted by Christians. Oh. Right, the wreath, the tree, it was co-opted by Christians from paganism, and there are a lot of traditions that, you know, I mean, I said this to the panel before we started, but I did not mean to dress for the room. If everybody looks around, it's like gray and purple. But the purple, I mean, historically, like, Jews wore purple at one point in the Hellenistic period. You know, that was a co-optation. There are certain practices that you know, you find in other cultures, like blessing over the wine and other things. And not to say that those were co-opted, but you know, there are similarities and there are threads that combine that connect everybody. But I mean, again, did anyone ask why is there a tree?
I wanted to end with us asking for your help. What do you think your most powerful message can be to the Jewish community in terms of understanding multicultural backgrounds and traditions And what kind of insight do we need to have to respond more powerfully and more authentically to people of mixed traditions?
I'd have to say just progressing with the times and like moving with the motivation of the people is probably something I think is really important. So kind of just when there's a demand, kind of like supply and demand. So if people want something, then you have to try and help them out. And like I know for someone like me, I need a really open heart and an open mind, because I can't like be a part of like a community that unless they really want me there. And like I don't want to kind of push myself into a community if they're kind of saying, well, I don't know about you, you're kind of unique and different. So I think that focusing on the similarities instead of the differences is also really important. Like if someone identifies themselves as half Jewish, well, they're still Jewish. I mean, they're still a person. They're still someone that is intending to follow something within them that they really want. And like you can't say no to someone like that. And if you do, then it's really gonna push them away, and they're not gonna be part of something like that anymore. And I think that's more hurtful than obtaining someone that is interested. So, like I said, keep an open heart and an open mind, and kind of look out for the people that are looking for something more, because they might be the ones that are gonna spice up the community or do something really cool and different with it. So it doesn't hurt.
So when I was coming to this conference, I was, it really did force me to think about a lot of things I hadn't thought before. And I used to be a really strong advocate for intermarriage and just, supporting that. And then I sort of went in a different direction, and I was like, well, I really understand the reasons for, why people wouldn't want to intermarry. And, and I sort of like went through this whole grappling with this idea and this concept. And I'm sort of at a point now where I don't have a strong opinion about it. I think that everybody should do whatever they feel is right. So I guess in that way, I'm totally not against intermarriage, but I'm very for inclusion. But I do kind of see the arguments on both sides, and I think ultimately people are concerned with the Jewish future, and I can understand why people have that concern, and I just think there's different ways that people are approaching it. So ultimately, I do think we're all on the same side, and we need to sort of work together to find out what's the best approach. My personal opinion is that the best approach is a wider tent. So I think that we need to be much more inclusive of people. I think it's a little bit, I don't know, it doesn't sit well with me, the idea that we won't accept the parents, but we want their children. That makes me uncomfortable. So I think that, generally speaking, the best way to promote a strong Jewish future is to include, the largest number of people possible and make them feel part of the community.
Well, so I came with a mission to talk to people who are doing Jewish outreach and give you a take-home message that you really need to make if you want to be inclusive, you need to make the inclusion really plain. Because we do experience the cumulative effect of slights on our identity. Mine, the ones that I've experienced, have not been too strong, but other people have heard things as strong as that, well, you are a fruit of a sin. And and these things add up, so there may be that, and then there may be some other things that seem smaller, but I mean, over time, it's a lot. So our sense of belonging can be repeatedly challenged by both Jews, generally outside of our family, and then sometimes non-Jews within our family. I think one of my relatives just realized that this wasn't a phase. So just like it's important to say plainly that that people who are GLBTQI, whatever, are welcome, it's also important to explicate the backgrounds of people who are welcome. So to say the words children and grandchildren of intermarriage, or other partnerships, or adopted children, or people who have DNA findings who are interested in exploring their Jewish ancestry and what that means to them. And also it's important to have programs that are moderated by people from mixed backgrounds like those of us up here have, rather than relying on intermarried couples, because our issues can be different. And thanks for the opportunity to say that.
One of the components of my organization is education. So education and leadership development. I find often that in settings where you're talking about the heirs of intermarriage, more often than not, that people aren't asking the heirs of intermarriage. They are talking about them either while they're sitting in the room, like parents would a child, or they're not even invited into the room to listen to what everybody else has to say. And again, this is why my organization exists, to create a platform for our voices to reach the community. But also, it is important for Jewish professionals and every community member to actually ask us what our needs are. Or else one person said, if you don't ask anybody what their needs are, you end up with a situation like Haiti, where you have lots of nonprofits going in and telling everybody what they need, instead of asking them, what are your basic needs? How can we expand our minds and our spaces to include you in it without compromising who you are, without compromising who we are? So ask us. Don't tell us. Ask us. And not everybody's going to have the answer. Not everybody is going to be receptive to the question. But you have to ask the questions in order to get the answers.
As I knew it would be, this was a powerful, empowering experience, certainly for me, and I know for many of those sitting here. I also know that if we added 3 more people beyond, that we would have 3 additionally different experiences. And if there is a takeaway message for all of us, I think that would be a strong piece of it. I want to thank Jared and Erica and Nika and Sarah for sharing themselves so openly and honestly. And Jared, I thank you for helping me to label what I do, because you talked about gatekeepers, and I realized that what I've always been is a gate opener, and I am proud to be able to continue to do that. So I thank you all from the bottom of our hearts.